Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I kind of want to talk about the random topic of reboots and kind of continuations, because as most people will kind of tell you, like, this is the age of reboots. And to me, it's always an interesting thing because obviously, like, for a lot of people, there's a negative connotation to like all these different movies kind of getting rebooted and everything. But at the same time, it's like, I'm kind of conflicted on whether I think that's a bad thing or a good thing. And I think maybe that's because a lot of times when it comes to reboots, I personally, like, at this point in time, there's never been a movie that I love and adore that's getting rebooted. I guess the closest thing to that was Spider-Man. Like, I mean, obviously at this point in time, Spider-Man's been rebooted like twice. But then again, it's like, even that's can't really count too, because like the cartoons are constantly always being rebooted too. So it's not like, I don't know. Like, in that regards, I can understand, but that's the closest thing that's ever happened, like, for something kind of being rebooted. Because, I mean, there's obviously the conversation of, like, because so many things are being rebooted, like, people aren't bothering getting, like, original movies out there and stuff like that, which is a valid argument and stuff like that. But also, it's also like, oh, this movie was so good in its time, don't try and bring it to this modern era, because you doing that, it just go, like, this movie was so near and dear to me. Like, an example of that, it's the Ghostbusters movie. A lot of people had a problem with the Ghostbusters movie. Yes, there are people who had a problem because it's an all-female Ghostbusters, but also people had a problem with it just because of just the fact is this is something so near and dear to my heart, and I refuse to ever let someone else kind of get a crack at it. It's like, leave that as it is, especially because with everything that kind of works with the Ghostbusters, making it seem like it isn't, you know, like the other Ghostbusters movies don't exist in this rebooted canon, you know? So that's another thing too, but once again, it's not, the Ghostbusters isn't anything I hold near and dear to me, so I was fine with it being rebooted. And it's like that with anything else. Like, a great example is, like, the next movie that's coming out is a remake of It, which is cool because, like, you know, that's a good thing with rebooted movies, because like some people may have never ever heard of the movie It. Like, maybe some people are familiar with the book, but they're like, oh yeah, the movie's from like, wasn't like the 80s, and it's like, you know, people might not be inclined to go back and watch like a movie that, you know, might be considered a classic, because some people might look at it as like, at the time that movie was terrifying, but now that I'm older, just, you know, the effects and everything, now I'm older, it's like the movie, you know, some people's eyes, certain movies might not hold up. So I mean, and that kind of leads into my other like discussion on that, is like, the fact of the matter is, when something gets rebooted, you've got like new actors that kind of portrayal and give maybe a different take on this character. You might have them kind of, new technologies available so that you can do a lot more, you know, like, take an example, like, you know, special effects as well as makeup have, you know, changed drastically from when they were then. So I feel like you're able to do, there aren't limitations like there might have been in the past. I mean, obviously, which has its give and takes, because some people are like, oh, because there were limitations then, people had to be more practical. Nowadays, everyone's kind of going CGI, so on and so forth. I'm not a movie nerd, so I don't kind of get like caught up in all of that situations of like, oh man, this and that, blah blah blah. I'm not, that's not my cup of tea. So, because the cool thing is, reboots also don't have to necessarily be just like, hey, this is like redoing this movie in a modern day, and obviously having to worry about twists and stuff like that. That's why I kind of brought in the aspect of continuation, because in a lot of situations, some things that are reboots are kind of continuations. Like, a great example would be like, I mean, Doctor Who, for example. Like, Doctor Who restarted, you know, after a long hiatus, came back in 2005, you know, with Christopher Eccleston as the Ninth Doctor. That's not like, it's a reboot in a sense of like, it's bringing new life to this like franchise that hasn't been like, you know, new content hasn't been made for it in a while, but it is a continuation because it's acknowledging all of the previous other, like the original Doctor Who series. So, you know, like I brought up earlier, kind of people's complaint with the, like, you know, Ghostbusters. And I think they kind of did a similar thing with the Terminator movie, Terminator Genesis. It kind of did that, kind of like, it's like a remake, but at the same time, it's like a continuation because it's taking that story but changing it up a little bit. So it's one of those things, like, a reboot doesn't always have to mean like, oh man, like they copied this movie, they got it beat for beat for beat. It's like, no, like they got this material and they're acknowledging the original material in some cases, and you're just like saying like, oh, we built upon that in this remake or something like that. I get it. Once again, like, everyone, like, there's a hardcore fan base for everything, and I've kind of talked about that in a previous video, but it's like being so certain, once again, like being so okay with something being like, this is how you remember this certain thing, and now you have someone kind of changing it, you know, with new actors and new people. You're like, I like this portrayal of these characters, I don't like this, so on and so forth, you know? I mean, arguably, I guess you can kind of count Deadpool as kind of a reboot too, because it's like, well, you got introduced to Deadpool in the X-Men Origins, but obviously there's like winks and nudges in that movie in Deadpool that kind of acknowledge that, but obviously, I mean, even then that's kind of hard to tell, because like the fact of the matter is Deadpool's such a referential character that breaks the fourth wall, so it's hard to say like whether does that count as that X-Men movie being continuity for Deadpool. Because like I said, again, like with reboots, you do give it the opportunity to reach a story is given to an audience who may never have known this story. There might be kids, younger people who never grew up watching the It movie. Like, I remember watching the It movie when I was younger, but I barely remember the movie because it's been so many years. So for me, to watch this remake would be like, it's like, oh man, like I slightly remember that from the original, but that's about it. It's like, oh man, because like it looks very terrifying, and I think, you know, as long as they're able to capture that feeling again, because that movie scared a lot of people. It scared the crap out of me, even at the point when I ended up watching it was like, what, the 90s I ended up seeing it. But even then, like, that's still, I think as long as you get able to capture that, and I think you do your own twist, your own little turns to it. You know, and at the same time, that's also another thing too, because it also has to be faithful to the book too, you know, because not only is it a remake, it is also an adaptation too, so that's another thing that kind of has to be kept in mind as well. But once again, like as I said earlier, like I've never been in that situation where I've had something I love and adore rebooted necessarily. Because I mean, at the same time, like I'm always looking forward to a reboot, because I'm like, oh man, this is gonna be interesting. We're gonna get new interpretations of characters, and a new take on stories, a different perspective. You know, like a great example is kind of going back to the Spider-Man situation, is comparing like Spectacular Spider-Man to like Ultimate Spider-Man. Like those are very different, two very different like styles of storytelling. Because in Spectacular Spider-Man, like to my recollection, Peter kind of handled things mainly on his own. But you have Ultimate Spider-Man, he's got S.H.I.E.L.D. behind him, he's got like White Tiger, Nova, and Danny and Luke, like, you know, as his team. And also it has a very different aspect of storytelling, because the fact of the matter is that like there are moments where like it kind of breaks the fourth wall and you have Peter talking to the audience. Like it kind of does that Saved by the Bell of like freeze framing something and then like, you know, the main character kind of talking. So that's something that's exclusive to Ultimate Spider-Man, which once again, this kind of falls in that same category of, well, you also have to consider the whole aspect of adaptations too, because there are a long list of material that Spider-Man comic books over the years that they can pull stories from. So even then, it doesn't have to be a situation of like, oh yeah, like they're doing their interpretation of this storyline that this said series did and stuff like that. I'm sure that can apply to the movies as well too. But at the same time, it's like along those same lines, like you can't, like there are different, like say for example, Venom's introduction in any Spider-Man canon is very different depending on what version you go by, because in some versions Eddie and Peter are like super good friends, they grew up together, or at least they've known each other for a while, and in other occasions it's like Eddie and Peter don't meet each other until like they're older and like they're in the workforce and they're kind of rivals and stuff like that. So it you know, that kind of plays another layer into it all on its own, you know. So ultimately I'd like to ask you that question: how do you feel about, you know, reboots / continuations? Are you for reboots? Are you against them? Do you feel differently because of the aspect of a continuation? Like, you know, does that make it better? Does it make it worse? Are you indifferent on the whole subject? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about in this video. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.